A man has decided to go into the arts after one of life's incidents, but which one? Today's story with a similar plot. Enjoy it! I woke up as the plane's landing gear hit the runway. I looked out the window and saw high snowdrifts along the runway. It seemed like the plane was about to hit them with its wing, but it didn't. People began to gather slowly. I took out my bag and followed my neighbor as we made our way to the exit. I said goodbye to the stewardess and walked down the dimly lit corridor. I had no luggage, so I went straight to the little cafe located under the roof of the terminal. "Good morning. What can I get you?" a tired-looking waitress asked, attempting a friendly smile, but not quite succeeding. "Please, a cup of coffee and 100 grams of cognac," I said. It was early morning, and I was the only one in the cafe. After placing my order, I went to the bathroom. I washed my hands and, after drying them in the dryer, returned to the cafe. I slowly drank some cognac, followed by coffee, and then paid before heading to find a taxi. It was almost 200 kilometers to my city. To pass the time on the road, I bought a bottle of whiskey and mineral water in a cafe. Entering the driveway, I looked at my watch. It was 8 o'clock in the evening. Without hurrying, I went up to my floor. Well, here I am at home, I thought. When I tried to open the door, it was clear that the lock had been changed. I pressed the bell button, but it took a long time for them to open it, even though I could hear music in the apartment. Finally, the lock clicked, and the door flew open. "What do you want?" a man in an unbuttoned shirt and wrinkled pants asked with a frown. I was a little taken aback, as I expected to see a grief-stricken mother, not a stranger. "Jacob!" "Who is it?" His mother's voice came from the depths of the apartment. "Call Reisa." I hadn't yet grasped the situation and tried to behave discreetly. "She's not here." The stranger gritted his teeth and tried to close the door, but I managed to put my foot down. Wasn't that her voice? I felt my anger rising. "Who are you?" The man came at me threateningly, trying to push me away from the door. "A horse in an overcoat." I didn't hit him hard in the liver. The man grunted and started sliding down the wall. At that moment, a well-groomed young woman, my mother, emerged from the bowels of the apartment. "Jacob! What's wrong with you?" Without looking at me, she ran over to the crouching man. "Are you bad?" "Mom, who is this and what's going on here?" Frankly speaking, I was shocked by my mother's behavior. She had recently buried her husband, my father. She didn't tell me the date of the funeral and time, and now she's pumping out some Jacob. "Edward? Where are you from?" She babbled, pressing Jacob's head to her chest. So I wanted to say, "From a camel." But I held back. Aunt Emily called me and told me that Dad had died. Unfortunately, she called too late, and I didn't make it to the funeral. One thing I don't understand is why you didn't tell me about my father's death. I was beginning to wonder why my mother didn't tell me. And the key word in that guess was Jacob. Mother was silent, apparently thinking of a reason, and Jacob, meanwhile, slowly began to come to his senses. He stood up, grunting, and with a shout of "I'll kill you, you bastard," he rushed at me. There is a category of people who don't get it right the first time. My mother had no time to say anything when her lover's jaw met my fist. This time it hit harder. Jacob, with all his mind on my fist, froze for a moment, and then flailed his arms, collapsed on his back, banging his head loudly on the floor. There was an anxious silence in the apartment. My mother looked at me with horror, covering her mouth with her hand. "It's good, as long as she didn't yell." "Who the hell is he? What is he doing in our house?" I shook my mother by the shoulders. "He's my friend?" Mother babbled. "The director. He helped with the funeral. He must be a close friend, walking around our apartment in a shirt over his bare body." Blood rushed to my face. "You weren't there when it happened, and Jacob helped me." Mother began to come to her senses. "Helped you with what? To pass the night?" I helped my mother up. "No sooner has she buried her husband than you drag some bastard into bed. In our apartment." "This is my apartment." My mother's voice came out. "This is our apartment. Until the will is opened." And then it will be just like Father wanted. I knew the contents of my father's will, but I didn't want to tell my mother about it yet. Especially after all that I have seen. Mother somehow at once slipped down. I opened the door to my father's studio. The couch was in its original place, only easels and unfinished paintings were piled in the corner. I looked at my mother questioningly. We thought it was unnecessary junk and were going to throw it away. My mother fidgeted with her bathrobe. We? Is that you and Jacob? Maybe you already got married? Maybe I don't know everything. I already shouted. Jacob and I have been together a long time. We love each other. My mother shivered as if she were cold. So you've been cheating on my father with that Jacob for a long time? Maybe it was you who sent him to the afterlife. I was really shocked. I knew for a long time that my mother was a common whore. But I did not assume that she is so cynical to openly make love to his Jacob 3 days after the funeral of her husband, my father. So, here's the deal. Take your treasure and get out of here, both of you. I hope your erotic playmate has a place to live. Not that it's any of my business. That freak's not gonna be here. Come and live on your own. Do you understand me? My face must have been scary because my mother flinched. I'll give you half an hour to pack. It's time to go. I went into the workshop and threw my backpack on the couch. I was born into a seemingly prosperous family. My father married after the army and worked in a factory. My mother graduated from a theatrical studio and worked in the provincial drama theater, playing minor roles. Like all unrecognized geniuses, she dreamed of a major role. And, as I began to understand later, was ready for anything to achieve his goal. She used to take me to the theater when I was little, since my grandmothers were still young and working. I didn't like going to nurseries and kindergartens, and I often used to sit quietly on the balcony watching the rehearsal and watching my mother get pinched by her boyfriend. Since then I've had a strong aversion to theater and glamorous bohemia in general. In the end, my mother achieved her goal by successfully sleeping with a director from the capital who had been exiled to our town for some fault. She got the lead role and from that time shone on the stage. Not stopping to roll in bed with this or that genius of the stage. My father, in addition to work, was also fond of painting. He wrote good portraits, landscapes, and still lifes. But times were hard. So my father, with the insulting, in my opinion, title amateur painter, could be content with just vernissages. I loved to watch him work, inhaling the smell of paint. Sometimes my father would show me how to paint, and I even tried to draw something on canvas myself. In 8th grade, several of my works took part in a competition, and one of them won 2nd place. That's how we lived. Dad worked at the factory during the day and painted in the evenings. Mom was busy rehearsing and in the beds of other lovers. It's hard for me, even now, to understand why my father tolerated my mother's infidelity. Why he didn't kick her out and marry a normal, faithful woman. I still don't have an answer to that question. I, meanwhile, finished high school, and when I turned 18, I joined the army. After a year of service, I went to military school. I didn't want to go back home. I was gripped by romance like a death knell. For years later, I graduated as a lieutenant in the army. I should mention that right after graduation, I got married. She worked in the press service and was attached to the brigade staff where I served. We didn't live long. She was bursting for the top and being married to an infantry lieutenant did not inspire her. My wife was seen several times in the company of senior officers. I was not going to repeat my father's fate and decided to end the relationship, which had reached a dead end. But fate decided otherwise. I was deployed to another hot spot, and I postponed the divorce until later. I was badly wounded. It was a very dangerous wound. In addition, I lost a lot of blood, and when they finally got me to a hospital, I was in a critical condition. When my father found out about my wound, he left everything and came to me. My mother was busy preparing for another performance and a rapidly developing romance with a young stage director, so she couldn't come. The truth, according to my father, was very worried about me, as they say now, remotely. After I was wounded, I lay in a coma for a long time, almost 2 months. The bullet entered between my ribs and pierced me through, fortunately, without damaging my vital organs. My father did not leave my side the entire time. So I lay there for another month. One day my wife came to visit me. She cried at my bedside for a long time, and then she left. I was told that she had gone away with some colonel. The divorce, for a while, hung in the air. When I felt better, my father went home, and I was hospitalized for 4 months until I was sent to the commission, where I was declared unfit for further service. I received my travel documents and my notice and safely departed to my home port. On the eve of my departure, my father's sister Emily called me and told me sad news. Dad had died. Even though my mother never told me anything. There must have been no time. She had lost her head between her lover and the funeral. She had forgotten all about her son. I kicked off my shoes and climbed onto the couch with my feet. When I was little, I would sit on it for hours, never taking my eyes off my father's hands as he created another masterpiece. Sometimes, tired of such contemplation, I fell asleep on the couch, and my father would carry me to my bed in his arms when he finished his work. For as long as I can remember, he was always there. Often he would meet me from school, just for no reason. He just wanted to be with me. We'd walk through the park on the way home. Sometimes, when Dad had money, we'd have coffee at a little coffee shop in Old Town. I suddenly remembered seeing me off to the army when he told me not loudly, hugging me goodbye, remember the oath. For all that, my father never served in the army. He was discharged right away because of illness. They were arguing about something behind the wall. My mother even raised her voice. Then the front door slammed. A few minutes later there was a knock on the door. "May I?" Mother's silhouette stood out clearly in the doorway against the dim light in the hallway. "Are you hungry?" I looked at my watch. It was almost 9 o'clock. Time for dinner. I went into the kitchen. My mother was setting the table, arranging plates and cups. Then, without saying anything, she served the food. We ate in silence. There was nothing to talk about. Everything was clear. When I had eaten, I thanked her for the food. "Mom, I'm going to see my father in the morning. Give me new keys so I don't have to ring the doorbell." My mother handed me a bunch of keys. I disconnected the right one and put it in my pocket. The next day I stood at my father's grave, remembering our last meeting. I remembered how he had said goodbye to me. How sad his eyes were. It was as if he had a premonition of his death, knowing it was our last meeting. His last words rang in my head. "Edward, don't leave your mother. Stay with her. She won't survive alone." And here, at the cemetery, at my father's grave, I suddenly understood why he didn't leave his philandering wife. He had loved her all his life. He loved her unrequitedly, truly. The next day I registered at the military enlistment office, transferred my pension, and started thinking about where to find a job. I was a mechanical engineer by civilian profession, so I decided to look for a job at some enterprise. I visited several factories, but, alas, I did not find anything suitable. My mother took a week off work. The good thing was that she was not involved in productions, and all this time sat at home. I saw that she was happy to see me, despite the fact that I unceremoniously drove her heart friend. By the way, this friend has not yet appeared on the horizon. Maybe he was afraid, maybe for some other reason. I was not discouraged about the job. I had money, and I could easily make it through the spring. One evening I began sorting through my father's possessions. A couple of large easels, stretchers with stretched canvas, some were even primed. Apparently my father hadn't stopped painting until the very end. I was suddenly desperate to pick up a brush and try to paint something on the canvas. I had already set the stretcher on an easel. But I stopped in time. The light in the room was dim, so it was not worth spoiling the canvas. The next day I took my father's box and portable chair, put on my warmest clothes, and went to the park. I set up my easel, laid out my paints, picked up my brush and started working. I came to myself when my feet ached with cold. I looked at my watch. It turned out that I had been in the park for 6 hours straight. "Lena, look how beautiful it is." A woman's voice rang out behind me. I wonder what she means, the park or my painting. "Are you an artist?" This question was clearly directed to me. I turned around slowly, with dignity. Behind me were two girls and with interest considered the fruits of my creativity. "Not really, just love to draw." "You are good at it." "Really, Lena?" The one of Lena nodded. "Yes, it's beautiful and somehow unusual. Not like the others." She paused for a moment and then added, "Artists." "Oh, and you look very cold, the tip of your nose is red." The first girl laughed. "Would you like some hot coffee? There's a little cafe not far from here." The second, as yet unnamed girl, nodded her head in agreement. I quickly gathered my things and went with my companions to the same cafe, where I often went with my father. The girls were pleasant companions. We got to know each other. The second girl's name was Emily. I also introduced myself, got up from the table and politely shook her hand. My friends tried to buy me coffee. But I'm a gentleman. So I took the initiative. I ordered coffee and cakes. I wanted more cognac, but the girls refused. We sat chatting politely about nothing. We talked a little bit about painting, art in general, and life in general. Slowly the conversation turned to everyday problems. It turned out that the girls are in their 4th year at a technical university. Why a technical university? They shrugged, apparently did not know the answer to that question. Time flew by imperceptibly. It was getting dark outside, and my new acquaintances were going home. Like a true gentleman, I volunteered to see them off. Lena lived in a hostel 3 stops away from the park. Saying goodbye, she quickly ducked into a warm foyer, and Emily and I stopped the cab. She lived far away, and, she said, there was no need to see her off. As a parting gesture, she stood on her toes and kissed me on the cheek. What do you call that? Love at first sight? All the way home I thought about seeing her today. I didn't find out where she was from, how old she was. Before my eyes stood her face, framed by blonde hair and with charming dimples on her cheeks. There was a surprise waiting for me at home. When I entered the apartment, I saw an expensive coat on a rack. Do we have guests? I wonder who. Was it Jacob? My mother came out of the room. She had tears in her eyes. Edward! Come into the room, we need to talk. I shrugged. There's been too much talk lately. In the room, a strange older man was sitting with his leg over his head. He looked at me with interest and nodded his head at my greeting. I'd like you to meet Edward, this is Valentine. After such an introduction, it is customary to shake hands. But the man didn't budge. Edward! I have something very important to tell you. My mother's voice sounded somehow guilty. Valentine is an old acquaintance of mine. I felt that my mother was trying to find the words to get to the point. Well, Edward, it's about your father. She looked expressively at her guest. He remained silent. If she had called him an alien, I probably would have been less surprised. What a surprise! The thoughts were rushing through my head at supersonic speed. Honestly, I didn't even know what to say about it. Fall into the arms of a new daddy, to cry from happiness smearing tears on hollow cheeks? Somehow, instead, I just wanted to punch him in the face. Honestly. I wanted to punch him in the face from the bottom of my heart. My hands itched to do it. I loved Valentine, and we were getting married. And I was pregnant with his baby. But my mother hesitated. But for various reasons we couldn't be together. So I married your father. He didn't know you weren't his son, so he raised you as his own. Mom had tears in her eyes. And now that I am free, Valentine found me. His wife died too, and they had no children. She took a breath. And he wants to take me and you too. Edward, you have to accept it. That's life. Finally, my newfound father spoke up. I have always loved your mother, and now that she is finally free, we want to be together. I heard him, and before my eyes stood the man who had raised me. Wearing an old coat and a cap he never took off even in winter. He wore boots, with stumbling heels. Always wearing glasses on his nose that were always crooked. Myopic eyes full of love for me. He couldn't afford to dress fancy. After all, he had to feed me. I had to buy clothes that would fall apart in a month after my trips to the yard with the boys. I had to buy a computer. You name it. He needed money for all that, and he spent it all on me, without a trace, just so I wouldn't need anything. And now it turns out he wasn't my father. It just happened. I looked at my mother. She was looking at her old acquaintance with a subservient smile. A family reunion. You could paint a picture. I was silent. The first shock had already passed. I just did not know what to say. One thing I knew for sure was that my mother had committed the ultimate cowardice by slipping her husband someone else's child. Every man dreams of having children of his own. They are his continuation. He, when he dies, lives on in their genes. And here? Poor Papa. Yes, Papa. I couldn't call him anything else. I had no right. Well, something had to be done. Guys. I didn't have the heart to call him father and her mother. I don't know who got who pregnant. You figure it out for yourselves. I was raised by my father. There can't be any other. You can't have two fathers, can you? You can do as you like, but leave me out of your games. That's all. I stood up. And I looked at my guest point blank. Good day. I can't say that it was a pleasure to meet you. A week later my mother somehow immediately forgot her Jacob, left with Valentine in his new life, and I was left alone. I got a job at a small technical firm, designing technological processes for production. The job was just in my line of work. The plant was producing artificial fiber by military order. Our bureau received a lot of money for the order, and I became the lead engineer. I continued to draw, sometimes going out into the countryside, but it wasn't serious. The relationship with Emily was developing rapidly. One day on another date, she told me that her parents were visiting another city. Emily invited me to her house after a little hesitation. It turned out that she and her parents lived in a cottage community outside the city. We climbed the steps of the marble-tiled porch, and Emily, digging in her purse, pulled out a bunch of keys. The heavy door opened on its well-oiled hinges. Here you are. She muttered and was the first to step through the dark doorway. A switch clicked, and we found ourselves in a large hallway. Paintings and expensive antique frames hung between the window apertures. A large burgundy rug lay on the floor, resting against the legs of an antique sofa. The door slammed, and an imposing older lady wheeled a serving table into the hall. My nostrils caught the aroma of coffee. In addition to the coffee pot, there was an open bottle of red wine on the tray. The lady silently filled the glasses, looked at me disapprovingly, and left. This is our housekeeper. Don't mind her. In the back of my mind, I knew where this was headed. But I also understood that I could not oppose it. After the third drink, Emily gently touched her warm hand to my cheek. And you're funny. The bedroom was on the second floor. A huge bed under a white four-poster, a bureau with feminine trinkets, elephants and kittens. The subdued light and the subtle scent of lavender. All this inspired madness. And I myself had no idea how I ended up in bed with a charming girl. We were able to stop only in the morning, without having sated each other. I woke up to the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Afraid to spill the hot drink on my chest, I carefully took the cup from Emily's hand. How was it? She asked. What do you mean? I pretended that I did not understand the question and took a sip of coffee. I was talking about coffee. What did you think about? And about the coffee, too. I felt so good that I didn't want to get up. Shall we continue? I put the empty cup on the bedside table. Little by little. Emily laughed, sprayed me with the scent of lavender, and kissed me on the lips. A month later we moved in together and were already thinking of getting married. In March, I tracked down my missing wife and filed divorce papers. We had no children and no jointly acquired property, so a month later I was already single. Nothing else stood in the way of my happiness with Emily. At the beginning of May, my father's will was opened. He left me his share of the apartment, the car, the garage, all his paintings, and the key to the safety deposit box. My mother was not present at this event. The next day, I was at the bank where my father had rented a safe deposit box. When the bank clerk and I opened the safe deposit box, the first thing I saw was a small picture in a cardboard box, several stacks of money, and a letter. I took the contents of the safe deposit box and bowed out. In the evening, while Emily was chatting with her girlfriends, I read the letter. Son, if you're reading this letter, it means I'm gone. I love you very much, although you are not my son. Your mother hides this fact carefully, but I have known about it from the beginning. She married me when she was already pregnant. But I didn't care, because I loved and love her to this day. I don't leave you much, but it's all I have. Big kisses to you, your daddy. I read the letter, and tears rolled from my eyes. Then I stared at the picture on the easel for a long time. A girl was playing the guitar. She was so realistic that it was impossible to take my eyes off her. The artist inexplicably managed to convey the full range of feelings of his heroine. The painting was so good that I didn't dare hang it on the wall. I just put it back in the box and hid it in the closet. The money was $30,000. It was, by the way, the wedding was coming up. Emily was already in full swing sewing her wedding dress, carefully hiding it from me. I had already visited her parents and asked them for her hand. The wedding was fixed for the middle of May. We started our wedding journey in Spain. In the middle of the day, the plane took us to Cordoba, an ancient city in Andalusia, nestled on the right bank of the Guadalquivir River, on the slope of the Sierra Morena. Being quite a European country, Spain has largely retained the features of the Arab states, which were once located on its current territory. Thus, Cordoba, in the distant past, the capital of the caliphate of the same name, with all its appearance, resembled an eastern city. Emily and I settled in a modern 5-star hotel, almost in the center of the city. But some unknown force kept beckoning me to the old town. My wife did not share my attraction, preferring to raid the glamorous boutiques. For a couple of days, I persevered through this frenetic wave of shopping. But on the third day, I finally escaped to wander alone through the narrow streets of old Cordoba. Spring was raging all around. Trees were already in full bloom. Here and there the streets were covered with small bushes of bright lilac flowers. And it also smelled excitingly of unfamiliar scents, brought by a light southern breeze, along with the hope for eternal happiness. I enjoyed wine, cheese, and rumba in a small outdoor cafe for a while, and then I went for a walk through the old town. I wandered aimlessly for a long time through the picturesque sights of Arab Cordoba. I was attracted by the sound of a guitar. As I rounded the corner, I saw a girl leaning over the instrument. A little girl was standing next to her and clicking her castanets. A rumba was playing. At first, it seemed to me like the music was desperately trying to break free. The melody was hesitant to squeeze between the houses, it needed space. And then the girl let it out. Throwing her hand down the guitar's fingerboard, she gave it complete freedom. The melody filled the street, every corner, every crevice. It quickly penetrated the souls of the people standing around the guitarist. The music was so piercing and passionate that people seemed to stop breathing. They did not take their eyes off the fragile figure. And the melody laughed and sobbed, soaring upward, searching for an exit to finally break free. Listening to it, people were thinking their own thoughts, each matching it with their own memories and feelings. Some even had tears in their eyes. The girl threw her hand down the fingerboard, and the melody vibrated on a high note. There was silence for a while. Then applause sounded, which turned into applause. The girl lifted her head, and I froze stunned, involuntarily leaning against the wall of the house, so as not to fall. The girl was looking at me, smiling enigmatically, from my father's painting. People gradually began to disperse. The girl put the guitar in its case, poured the change into a tin can, and taking the little girl's hand, headed for the steps leading to the antique shop sheltered in the basement. I came to my senses and slowly followed her. "Señorita," I called softly. The girl stopped and turned around. She asked me something in Spanish. Apparently, she wanted to know what I wanted. I took out of my pocket $200, all I had, and gave it to her. She was embarrassed to say something, apparently trying to explain that it was too much to pay for a gig. But I insisted, and she smiled and took the money. She quickly said a few phrases in a melodious voice, evidently to thank me, and went down the stairs and disappeared behind the door padded with copper strips. I followed her down the time-worn steps and pushed open the massive door. A bell rang in the back of the shop, and the owner, an elderly man with a picturesque gray beard, appeared before me. He wore a long oriental robe, tied with a colorful cord, and a small black cap that barely covered his head. If I hadn't known I was in Europe, I might have thought the shop was in Baghdad or Istanbul somewhere. On the wooden shelves were some ancient copper jugs, Arabic manuscripts in leather bindings and with brass clasps, and collections of smoking pipes and hookahs. I looked around for the girl, but she was nowhere to be seen. The owner, like me, had great difficulty in speaking English. He waved his arms, mixing English and Spanish words, and began to offer me his goods. But after a while his passion faded. I am not interested in antiques and got into the shop by chance. I was not going to buy anything. I somehow explained to the owner that he was wasting his time and was just about to leave, as he suddenly opened the old chest and pulled out a small Morocco leather box. Inside it was a man's ring of white metal. It was an ancient signet ring, with half-erased inscriptions in Arabic. I was immediately attracted by the ring. I looked at it for a long time, held it in an open palm, and, unexpectedly for myself, put it on the ring finger of my right hand. It fit as if an unknown master had made it especially for me. I don't know why, I suddenly wanted to buy it. I looked up at the owner and asked his price. I thought I saw a change in his expression. He even looked at me with a kind of respect and after a short pause suddenly called the amount, which for my standards, was clearly understated. I shrugged my shoulders and suddenly remembered that I had no money. I gave it to the girl with the guitar. I regretfully took off the ring and handed it to the owner. The owner bowed and quickly babbled in an unfamiliar language. Grandfather Yusuf says that it is not an ordinary ring. There is a belief that it is the ring of the Caliph of Al-Hakam. Suddenly there was a voice behind me, spoken in a melodious female voice. I turned around. The same girl from the street was smiling at me, and beside her, holding onto the hem of her dress, stood a little girl, looking at me curiously with big blue eyes. The ring is made of iron that fell from the sky. The stranger smiled again and tilted her head slightly. The shopkeeper, as if he understood what it was all about, nodded his head several times. The girl said a few phrases. The old man looked at me strangely and answered her something. Grandpa Yusuf says it's a gift. Grandfather says that you are a good man and asks me to accept it. The stranger smiled again. I'm good at making coffee, according to an old Arabic recipe. Would you like to try it? Suddenly she asked. Together we sat for a long time at a small table in a cool, tiny courtyard, next to a small fountain. I wanted to ask her how she knew French so well, but I dared not. Finally, the sun disappeared behind the tiled roofs and it became quite dark. It was time to leave. I thanked my host and the unexpected interpreter. I went outside. I looked at my hand. The ring was tight on my finger. The metal was dull and did not reflect the light of street lamps. I mentally waved my hand and headed in the direction of the noisy market, despite the evening. After walking a few houses, I suddenly decided to go back. I walked in the opposite direction, and, according to my calculations, in a few steps, I should have passed an antique shop. I walked 10, 20, 50 paces, but the shop was gone. I turned around and walked back. There was a fruit stand, a boutique with clothes, and then there should be an antique shop. But there was none. I looked at my hand. The ring is still there. I stood for a while, trying to gather my thoughts. I had no choice but to go back to the hotel. That night Emily and I were passionately in love. It seemed that our happiness would never end. But before my eyes stood the girl with eyes as blue as the Andalusian sky, passionately playing an antique guitar. The girl whose name I never asked. The next day we left Cordoba in the evening, taking with us the spicy aroma of its narrow streets and the sad melody of the rumba. After soaking in the beaches of Mallorca we returned home. And everyday life began. I worked in the office, coming up with new technical solutions for our clients. Gradually we began to enjoy a steady demand and soon moved to new premises. In September, the owner invited me in and unexpectedly offered me the position of his deputy and a partnership. His plans were to expand the business, and he desperately needed partners and competent specialists. Consequently, my salary increased, and my father-in-law and mother-in-law began to look at me more favorably, not to mention my young wife. Emily was in her 5th year of college and would soon be a graduate engineer. But I could see that the impending prospect did not particularly inspire her. She was more interested in wandering with her friends through boutiques and social events. I understood her well and did not particularly hinder her from leading a glamorous life. We lived at my place, mostly because Emily was close to me and me at work. But on weekends we always stayed at her parents' house in the country. The closer it got to graduation, the more intense the classes became. Emily began to stay late at the university and take extra classes at the library. One day she told me over dinner that several students from Swaziland, a small country on the African continent, had been added to her group. Each student was assigned a black foreigner to develop their speaking skills. Emily was assigned Maurice, also a graduate student. Emily selflessly took on her mentee in an effort to develop his French language skills, studying with him in the evenings in the classroom. As I was driving past the university, I saw Emily standing on the porch with a tall black guy. She was saying something to him, laughing merrily and holding his hand. That evening I cautiously began to ask my wife about her mentee. She sensed the carefully concealed jealousy in my words and said with a laugh that it was foolish to be jealous of a foreigner. She added that she loved me very much and did not need anyone. At the beginning of spring, Emily became pregnant. I greeted the news of the impending child with joy. I didn't care whether it was a boy or a girl, as long as it was our baby. I never thought I would look forward to having an heir or heiress. Strangely enough, Emily was not at all happy about the news. It would seem that she, as an expectant mother, should take the news of her pregnancy with enthusiasm. She could not feel any stress because she was supposed to give birth in a legal marriage. But my wife was acting nervous for some reason. Sometimes in the morning she would furtively wipe her weeping eyes. But I chalked it up to prenatal anxiety. My wife's pregnancy did not affect her studies. She successfully passed her exams and defended her diploma. When we were at the graduation banquet, she was invited several times by her mentee, an African who already spoke French quite clearly. Apparently, he was very grateful for Emily's help because he kept saying something in her ear while she was dancing. At the end of the summer, the African left for Swaziland to raise industry and agriculture, and in November, Emily gave birth to a baby girl. A new life came for me. I had become a father. Like all the other happy-go-lucky husbands, I hung out under the windows of the maternity hospital, hoping to see my offspring. It seemed to me that there was no happier man in the world than I was. But my mother-in-law explained to me that Emily had had some complications and had been moved to a separate, isolated room. I tried to call her back, begging her to take a picture of our daughter on my iPhone, but she blurted something about the doctor's prohibition and turned off the phone. But what could stop a happy father from seeing his child? With the help of generous healthcare donations, I sneaked into the carefully camouflaged room. I cautiously approached the door and quietly opened it. I was afraid of disturbing the nursing mother with my sudden appearance, so I tried to be discreet. I held a bouquet of white roses in one hand and slowly opened the door with the other. Emily was sitting on the bed breastfeeding her baby. What could be more beautiful than a nursing mother? Looking at this idol, I experienced an unimaginable mental thrill, simultaneously falling into a stupor. Tears came to my eyes. But not from the picture itself, as you might think, but from the fact that the baby was radically black. A week later her parents took Emily home. Her father called me and asked me to come over. There was going to be a family council, where one of the main characters was me. When I walked into the vast hallway, the whole family was assembled. Even the two grandmothers had been pulled up. Emily, seeing me with sobs, ran to my chest, trying to tell me through sobs how she loved me and how she cannot understand why everything happened. Her father was the first one to speak. He talked at length about how a real man must bravely bear the hardships and deprivations of life. That the color of his skin meant nothing, that it was too early to draw any far-reaching conclusions. By the way, he told me that in South Africa a completely white couple had a baby boy who was completely black. and that the reason might be recessive genes. Anyway, hang in there, Edward. You're a man and a black daughter is no reason to abandon her white mother. Then her maternal grandmother took the floor. She suddenly remembered that her great-great-grandmother had spoken of her love affair with a black clerk during a fair in 1913. How many years later it came back to haunt her? Mournfully murmured the grandmother and spluttered her hands. All a sigh of relief. Your daughter, Jura, and do not doubt. What is your blood type? A positive? And the girl has the same. You see, everything fits. Everyone smiled. My Emily stretched her lips wider than the others. I responded to this wave of positivity. I talked at length about how I loved them all wholeheartedly and each individually. I told them that I had always sympathized with our black brothers, brutally oppressed by the colonizers. That black people are one of the most important things in my life. Everyone looked at me approvingly. It's always nice when your son-in-law is a complete idiot. But I made them sad. I pulled out of my pocket a double-folded piece of paper with a DNA test on it. It said, in black and white, that my chances of being the father of an adorable black baby girl were next to zero. While the silent scene lasted, I politely said goodbye and asked Emily to give my warmest regards to Maurice from Swaziland. At the same time, I asked him for alimony. I also told him that I had filed for divorce and the corresponding suit for non-recognition of paternity. As I spoke, I had a picture in my mind of a lanky African man laughing happily, holding my wife's hand. I got home in my father's car fairly quickly. I got a bottle of vodka out of the fridge, sliced some lard, and poured a full glass. It's hard to say what I was celebrating. Chronic bad luck with women, an impending divorce, or something else not yet formed in my head. Then I put the portrait of the girl with the guitar on the easel and sat still for a long time, listening to the sad melody of the rumba and slowly sinking into her blue eyes. I drove cautiously down the ice-covered street toward home. Today was the first court hearing for my divorce. All this time I had been living in anticipation of the event. I hadn't seen Emily, and I wasn't looking forward to it. To be honest, I have had enough of my relatively short life, communicating with women. Is it my karma or just bad luck? But on my road to get only these. Unfaithful, sneaky, and treacherous. What was Emily counting on, trying to stick me with an illegitimate child? And a black one at that. You had to be a complete idiot to believe a story about a grandmother who had sinned. If a black child comes into a white family, it is not because of grandma or grandpa. It is a much more prosaic reason. Look for a black lover or neighbor. Women will think of many things to hide their fornication. Strange that Emily didn't bring in an alien mind. Such gloomy thoughts came to my head time after time, poisoning my life. Our good court, standing to the death for the interests of women, gave us 2 months to reconcile. As if that could ever be reconciled. Emily, my mother-in-law, and her mischievous grandmothers all shed tears at the trial. My father-in-law even went so far as to call me a racist. I listened in silence to all this nonsense, wanting only one thing. That all of this would be over as quickly as possible. The months of reconciliation dragged on. Emily called every day, promising me a mountain of gold if I forgave her and returned to the fold of the family. Then her father got involved in the process. About a month after the first court hearing, he called me and asked to see me. We were sitting at a table in a small cafe. His black car was parked outside the window, where Emily, who had not given up hope of a reconciliation, was most likely sitting. I did not understand what we could talk about in that situation, but agreed to a meeting that the former father-in-law finally get rid of me. I will no longer persuade you to return to my daughter. He started from afar. I have a proposition for you. My father-in-law chewed his lips, setting himself up to talk. Emily is still young, very young even. She can start her life over again. So what if she made a mistake? It didn't work out with the baby. He paused for a moment and then he continued. She can still get married and have a happy family. Marriage to you would be a lesson to her. I would pay you a lot of money if you would keep your mouth shut about the reasons for the divorce. We just didn't see eye to eye. It happens. He stopped talking again, lit a cigarette. I have an up-and-coming boy who might make a good husband for my daughter. The most important thing is that he doesn't find out about the girl. I'll make a deal with the judge." He grimaced at that. "What do you say? I wonder how you are going to hide the child and where?" I hummed. "That's not your concern. I'm only paying you to keep quiet. The baby is my problem." My father-in-law took a napkin and wrote a 5-digit number on it. "Would that suit you?" With his index finger he moved his scrawl to me. I squinted my eyes. Not a bad price for silence. "It seems to me, Nikolai, that you take me for a wrong person." I pushed the note back. "I only need a divorce, and the rest is your family problems. I do not need the money. I'm not going to talk about my divorce in every corner. So let your daughter sleep in peace." That phrase sounded ambiguous. "That's not all. You have to leave town. Anywhere you want, as long as it's far away. It is a flimsy, but at least some guarantee of your silence." My father-in-law poked his cigarette butt into the ashtray and looked at me intently. "That's my plea for you." He emphasized the word convincing and looked at me intently. I wonder if I should go to Mars, just to be sure. Not only had his prodigal daughter ruined my life, but her daddy had decided to finally stab me in the back. I promised to keep quiet about the reason for the divorce. But I'm not leaving town. Why should I? I stood up, making it clear that the conversation was over. "Watch out, Edward, so that you don't regret it later." My father-in-law looked at me with a cold, full, barely contained rage. "What a family! One is worth another. Oh, how my ex-father-in-law does not like to be openly sent on an erotic journey." I soon forgot about this conversation. In the middle of January there was a second court session. None of my former relatives showed up at the hearing. We didn't have any property disputes, the child wasn't mine. So everything went quickly. I was given the court order and wished me a happy journey to a new life. All this despite the fact that the judge, a heavy-limbed, lanky woman, was looking at me disapprovingly. That was it. That was the end of it. No more weddings. At the end of January, the chief summoned me. He hesitated for a long time, not daring to start a conversation. "Edward, you're very valuable to me as an employee. But now we are having difficulties with contracts. Accordingly, the income has decreased. I can't keep the position of deputy director on the staff," he said, looking at me guiltily. "To stay afloat, I have to reduce the management staff. It's nothing personal. I get it. You've decided to cut my position in the administrative apparatus, not the position of personal advisor. Of course, I do not have assets like your Ladaka." I ironically remarked. "And what about the patents on my inventions? They belong to me, not your company. I'm ready to buy them back from you for a reasonable amount." My boss became visibly bored and nervously fidgeted in his chair. "No, I need them myself." I smiled, knowing that without my inventions, this office would go under. No matter how firm Lidaka's assets might be, or how luscious her breasts adorned her bust, they cannot invent something like mine. I was the engineering brain of this firm, and the chief understood that very well. "Edward, don't be so hasty. The crisis will pass, and I'll hire you again. Especially since you have almost 30% of the shares. You'll live off the dividends for now." The chief twiddled his hands. "But I'm ready to sell the shares, at market value." I stood up. "Right now." "Don't be silly, Edward." The chief stood up, too. I raised my hand, ending the conversation. The February evening seemed endless to me. Loneliness did not depress me. There was no loud music playing in the room. I turned on my father's old radio, which I could not throw away. Almost a month had passed since I had been fired. I tried several times to get a job. There were vacancies, and engineers were needed. But as soon as they heard my last name, the HR people's faces turned dull, and they, hiding their eyes, tried to get rid of me as quickly as possible. There was no work for me in this city. I exhaled the smoke. And at that moment, the doorbell rang. I wonder who it is. I'm not expecting anyone. After a divorce, Friends disappeared all at once. My social circle narrowed, or rather disappeared. At the door stood a garishly dressed woman, and behind her loomed an unassuming man, dressed in a brown coat with a warm lining. Both characters were covered with sticky February snow. "Hello! May we come in?" the uninvited guest spoke in a defiant voice. "Who are they? Why did they come?" These questions swirled around in my head. But I couldn't find an answer. I stood in silence for a while, trying not to look the stranger in the face. The pause was clearly drawn out. "So, shall we come in?" the woman asked again. "And what do you want?" I finally loosened my lips. "It's about the apartment. How much do you want for it?" The woman smiled at the corners of her lips and looked at me expectantly. "I'm not selling anything." I shrugged my shoulders. "Someone has misled you." "How strange. And what do you say to that?" She handed me a quadruple folded newspaper. On the last page, placed in a separate announcement, was an ad for the urgent sale of a 2-bedroom apartment. My apartment? The address and my cell phone number were listed. We urgently needed a place to live, so we decided to come see. Without calling beforehand, the man spoke up. "This is a misunderstanding. I'm not selling an apartment." I slammed the door without listening to their objections. First the job, now the apartment. I went back to my room, poured half a glass of cognac, and drank it in a gulp. Warmth spread through my body. I set up an easel and put a stretcher with a canvas on it. I turned on the overhead light, turned up the music, and made the first stroke with a light movement of the brush. I created until morning. I ran out of one bottle. I opened another one and could not stop. Finally, drunk and exhausted, I collapsed on the couch. I woke up in the afternoon. It was already getting dark outside the window. A girl with a guitar was looking at me from the wall with pity. My head hurt. But I decided to see what I had accomplished. The moon was shining brightly, leaving a thin silvery trail on the country road. A young man in a multicolored clown hat was walking along it, holding the hand of a little black girl. They walked toward the full moon, gradually dissolving in its ghostly light. I couldn't see their faces. As they walked away from me, I could only see their backs. I touched the canvas carefully with my fingers. The paint was almost dry. I took a thin brush, dipped it in black paint, and in the lower left corner, wrote my initials, ER, in capital letters, then thought for a while and put the date below. One day in early March, I was coming back from the store. I hadn't yet run out of money from the sale of stocks. But given that my job wasn't going well, I was trying to save money, so I stocked up on relatively cheap groceries. I was a stone's throw from my house when an elderly woman who was walking toward me suddenly stopped and called my name. "Edward." "Hello. Don't you recognize me?" She smiled and fixed her bangs in her hat. "I'm Marta, the Shidlovskys' housekeeper." I remembered this woman. I had seen her at Emily's house on our first date. "How do you do?" I answered politely, not knowing what to talk to her about. "And Emily is getting married." Marta blurted out what she thought was the most important news, for some reason thinking I should know. Very happy for her, I shrugged. She found her Maurice after all. "No. She is going to marry our boy, the son of Nicholas's partner." The housekeeper's eyes shone with happiness, as if she were getting married. Where did the girl go? Or did the groom love Emily so much that he would do anything? Even accept a black stepdaughter? No. Michelle was taken 2 months ago. Emily wrote a renunciation of the baby. Marta's voice became a little sad. And the father? God help you, Edward. Who's going to find him? Marta glowed again. I'm so happy for Emily. I can't say the same. I walked around the clingy lady and went home without saying goodbye. As soon as I opened the door of the apartment, the phone rang. Edward? A woman's voice muttered in my ear. It was the police. Senior Lieutenant Simonova. When can you be found at home? What happened? Puzzled, I asked. It seems that I did not have any problems with the police. You received a complaint. You have to vacate the apartment. It was sold, and you don't want to vacate the place. The buyers are complaining. There was a short ringing tone on the phone. The next day, a delegation came to see me. A young cheeky girl, the police, and an already familiar couple who had visited me before. Mr. Reshetnikov, your apartment has been sold. You must vacate the premises. The senior lieutenant got straight to the point. The buyers? I nodded in the direction of the sweet couple. Can I see the documents? The woman with a disgruntled face gave me the bill of sale. Under seller was the name of my mother. The situation became more or less clear. My mother owned only a third of the apartment. 2/3 is mine. In the bill of sale, it was the whole apartment. In addition, the sale transaction is invalid without my permission. The seller should have offered his share to me first. I took the copies of the documents for the apartment out of the sideboard and handed them to the policewoman. She ran her eyes over them and shrugged her shoulders. Go to court. And now you must vacate the premises. I have my orders. I'm not leaving my house. I was beginning to boil. And I'm going to ask you to leave. You broke into my apartment without permission, so please leave. I opened the front door. Please. Apparently, I had a belligerent look, so the uninvited guests thought it best to retreat. Finally, the lieutenant said with anger, If you do not get away, you're out of here by force. I was silent and slammed the door. A day later, I received a summons to court. I tried to contact my mother to clarify the issue of the apartment. But she hadn't been in touch for a long time. And I didn't have her new address or phone number. And what did I want to hear from her? The judge didn't think long. It was obvious. My mother had no right to sell the whole apartment. Especially not without coordinating the deal with me. A blow of the gavel and the deal was invalidated. But I was wrong, that wasn't all. A day later, I was attacked in our archway. I was on my way home, it was already dark. 3 figures stepped toward me. One had a bicycle chain dangling from his hand. It looked like the other 2 were also equipped for a fight. I didn't wait for the attack and took out the first assailant with a kick to the kneecap. His colleagues attacked me from 2 sides. I turned and ran, tracking my opponent with the corner of my eye. One of the attackers lunged slightly forward. I turned sharply and clipped him. The body flew over my leg and slammed against the pavement. The third stalker stopped, and in his hand, in the light of the lantern, the blade of his knife gleamed. I took a step forward. The fallen bandit staggered to the side. There was no time. I managed to intercept the hand with the knife and sharply break it down. The man cried out. The attacker sagged in pain, and I kneed him in the face. He went down on his face. Look out! They're killing me! Someone near me yelled in a bad voice. I pulled up my collar and ducked into an alley. March came to an end. There was no work, and the money was gradually melting away. I saved as much as I could. I even stopped driving my car and put it in the garage. More than once I thought of parting with the car altogether. One day, I was returning home after another unsuccessful attempt to get a job. My gaze was drawn to a large colored banner stretched across the street. There was an exhibition of young artists at the art gallery, starting on April 15th. Everyone was welcome to participate. I photographed the banner and decided to go to the address. Indeed, an exhibition was being organized to sell paintings by young artists. 3 works per participant were accepted. There was no entry fee. This fact made me especially happy. I noted the terms and went home for the paintings. I put together 2 of my father's more or less interesting landscapes and, after thinking for a while, added my painting with a clown. It was nothing, of course, but I decided to indulge my ego. They accepted my paintings and asked who the artist was. I told them that I had the paintings by accident and that I didn't know the author's name. I allowed myself to sell 2 of my father's paintings. I decided to keep my own painting. I had put too much of my soul into it. The attendant didn't want to hear me, handed me a receipt for the paintings, and politely invited me out. The exhibition lasted a month, and the auction was held in the middle of May. The next day, I got a call and was invited to a buffet in honor of the end of the exhibition. I put on more or less decent jeans, a burgundy sweater, a Spanish ring on my finger to complete the look. I shaved, splashed on some leftover cologne, and opened the doors to the showroom at precisely 6 p.m., plunging headlong into the world of glamour. I walked around the showroom once, and then again. I did not see my own pictures. Well, why should I be surprised? I was unlucky. Cautiously making my way through the crowd, I headed for the exit. Suddenly, a group of people in the middle of the room was looking at something. In the middle of the room, on an easel surrounded by orange ribbon, stood my painting. At the bottom of the frame was a plaque with the title Night Road in the Moonlight. For some time, I stared at the bright canvas in amazement. "Edward?" A woman's voice whispered softly behind me. I turned around. Smiling at me was a pretty blonde of Balzacian age. "Eleanor, the gallery owner. Could we talk to you?" I shrugged my shoulders. "We can talk." We went out the side door and found ourselves in a cozy, purely female office. "Edward, your painting is of interest to us. They wanted to buy it at an auction and were disappointed to hear it wasn't for sale. Our exhibition was visited by Mr. Mancini, a well-known contemporary art collector from Turin. He owns a large private gallery and is very interested in meeting you." She handed me a black business card embossed in gold and a colorful Turin gallery catalog printed on glossy paper. "If you decide to meet Mr. Mancini, just dial this number." Eleanor jabbed her finger at the number printed in gold. "Good luck. I am always glad to see you." The gallery owner stood up to signify that the audience was over. In the evening, I called the number, and my life had drastically changed. It has long been an axiom that spontaneous demand for this or that artist is unpredictable and irrational. Another thing is demand that is carefully planned, artificially created by a team of talented PR people. This process has nothing to do with the terms genius and mediocrity. It is nothing but a well-organized show, causing a wild burst of excitement. A couple of articles in prestigious magazines, preferably glamorous. Then a couple of articles in major publications of renowned experts in the art world. And finally, an auction, at which for a huge sum of money the work of a hitherto unknown artist goes to a collector who wished to remain anonymous. And that's it. Commences the rush. The paintings are bought up for huge sums of money, and the higher the price, the stronger the demand. The most important thing is not to let the public's interest wane. A few more articles about the work of an unrecognized genius. You can even scold a little. Warm up interest on contrasts. When the goal is achieved and the stash is emptied, and the money with a pleasant rustling in the pockets of the dexterous crooks, you can switch to the next unrecognized genius. And everything repeats itself. I could name famous artists today who have gone through this process. But in this case, we are talking about me. After meeting Mr. Mancini, my painting left for Italy, and in my pockets settled a respectable sum in dollars. When he left, the weasel Italian ordered several more paintings in the same style, don't know what about. I bought paints, stretchers with canvases, brushes, and spray cans. And I started to create. In 2 weeks, I made 6 paintings in the freestyle. That's how I saw the reality around me. You like it, look at it, and if you don't like it, go to the garden. Senor Mancini was thrilled. Since my creations had no artistic value so far, it was easy to take them abroad. A couple of months later, my client brought me a colorful French magazine with an article about an unknown young artist from France with great promise. It showed photo reproductions of several of my works, including A Night Road in the Moonlight. Eleonora, the owner of the art gallery, recognized me for it. She offered to hold an exhibition of my work. That would be nice, but the work still had to be painted. So I got to work. By the opening of the exhibition, there were almost 8 canvases. I suggested that they should be diluted with my father's work, on which I put my initials, and the exhibition was ready. Yes, it was a success. People stood in line at the box office to buy tickets. Art lovers came from other cities. There was even a whole delegation from London. People walked around the room, looked at the canvases, and must have seen something, each in his own way. The exhibition was extended twice. The incognito artist was of particular interest. Who is this talented painter? Articles about the nugget from the provinces appeared in metropolitan magazines. The process, artificially heated, went on a downward spiral. I accumulated a fair amount of money in my account. I turned my father's apartment into a workshop, and he moved out of town, to a prestigious cottage community. Everything was going great. I made a huge number of friends, and most importantly, girlfriends. I was considered the author's agent, and through me, they were looking for ways to approach him. Even my ex-girlfriend came to my attention. One summer evening, my doorbell rang. I wiped my paint-stained hands and opened the door. Emily? It was a surprise. I moved aside, letting the unexpected guest into the house. Emily filled me with the scent of perfume and cognac. She was afraid to come sober. I gave her some tea and listened to a long monologue. She told me that all the time she had loved only me, that her relationship with the African agrarian had been a fatal mistake. That when she gave herself to him on the dusty table, she thought only of me. And so on, in a similar vein. I took a moment to look away from the contemplation of the newly created canvas and looked at my ex. Emily had become even more beautiful since our breakup. Everything is so firm and appetizing. Only from her face did not leave the expression of some mortal longing. I had not had a woman for a long time, and here was such a beauty. Why not? Especially the former relative. During the night, Emily and I remembered a lot. In the morning, she fell asleep, exhausted. I quickly packed up and left for the workshop, asking security to take the keys from my ex-girlfriend when she left. That night didn't change anything in my relationship with Emily, or rather the lack thereof. So, we crossed paths for a moment, and then we went our separate ways. Time passed. I kept waiting for the interest in my creations to wane. But so far so good. Several paintings were bought by the largest bank in our city. One even hung in the governor's office. Everything was great. The intrigue with the unknown artist only further fueled interest in his work. One day, a saddened Mancini came to see me. Several of my paintings were not allowed through customs. The Ministry of Culture finally realized that national treasures were flowing out of the country and put my painting in the register of prohibited exports. But the Italian found a way out. As long as everything was going according to plan, I should spend some time in Europe and paint there. We agreed that I would work in Spain, in a villa on the Atlantic coast. And I got ready to hit the road. I sold all of my father's paintings, except for the portrait. I didn't have much to do at home. My mother was lost in the country with her lover. There was, however, one problem that kept me up at night. But I was close to solving it. All this time I had not burdened myself with long-term relationships with women. The mere thought of having someone near me who would try to restrict my freedom made me uncomfortable. Emily had tried many times to meet me, but there was no way. She had failed to get to me, or rather to my body and money. I learned from my friends that all this time she had been trying to find her daughter. She had a guilty conscience after all. But she didn't succeed. Michelle was adopted by good people and her trail went cold. Emily, in desperation, slit her wrists. She was saved, but she flatly refused to live. She just didn't see the point in it. This happens to people, especially women who have abandoned their children. To somehow stop the process of self-destruction, her parents put Emily in a neurosis clinic and locked her up in a separate ward isolated from the world, where she began to go insane little by little. Finally, the problem that was keeping me from living was solved, and the day of the flight arrived. We arrived at the airport a half hour before boarding time. We quickly checked in and headed for the terminal. An imposing, young man, carefully carrying in his arms a little black girl, made people smile kindly. P.S. Emily stared up at the ceiling without seeing anything. She did not live, but simply existed. She had already forgotten when and how she had gotten here. Her whole past life was beyond the red line. She was not crazy. It just didn't make sense to go on living without a child. That's what happens in life. Suddenly, you realize that you destroyed your own happiness with your own hands, and the worst thing is when you realize you can never get it back. Emily dreamed about Michelle every night. The image of her abandoned child followed her everywhere. One day the door opened, and a handsome, gray-haired man entered the room. "Emily, this is Mr. Mancini. He has a letter for you." In a nauseatingly sweet voice, the nurse muttered. The man smiled and handed the woman a thick envelope. "Read it, I'll wait outside." With a slight accent, he said, and stood up, adjusting the robe slipped from his shoulders. Emily tore off the corner. Inside the envelope, there was a plastic card, a plane ticket to Cordoba, and a photograph. She took the picture in her hand. In the picture, a young man was looking at her with a black girl in his arms. They were smiling happily, and it seemed to Emily that their eyes were penetrating her soul. On the back was written, "Mommy. Come soon. P.S. What does the portrait and the caliph's ring have to do with it? You ask. I don't know, maybe not. Or maybe. What do you think of our story today? It seems to me that the man, thanks to his divorce, has found his calling in life. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. See you in the next video.